Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so in this video, I'd like to talk about NPD and cluster B recovery, but from a spiritual perspective. Okay, now when I talk about spirituality, I use, I think, more of a philosophical definition of spirituality as opposed to a religious. So I'm not talking about supernatural, I'm not talking about religious stuff, but I do think spirituality is very important. And I am upset to a point. It's frustrating to me that in our mainstream consciousness, when we use the word spirituality, it's basically taken to mean supernatural, and we don't really have a meaning or a connotation where we can take the word spirituality and understand it maybe in more philosophical terms. Okay, I think that's unfortunate because I don't see another word that's adequate to that has the right. In other words, I can't think of another word to use where that would have the same power as the word spirituality for what I'd like to talk about. Okay, so when I talk about spirituality, I'm really talking about perspective. Okay, but I'm talking about perspective sort of in a way that would almost be like psychedelic, really. It's in the sense that it's very powerful. What I mean is, I think every person, I think we have the ability to abstract away from even human interest, not just self interest, but even human interest. Okay. In other words, because humans are very abstract and because we are philosophical, there is a part of us that can abstract away and get perspective that's even away from even human interest. Okay. Because our imagination is that powerful. So I think that when we become abstract enough to have a vision or a vista, let's say a panorama, a way of looking at, let's say, considerations in the environment, when we can get that sort of remote sort of perspective, that sort of dispassionate, neutral perspective that's abstracted away, not just from self-interest, but also from human interest. Okay. I think that that very abstracted position is the sort of the limit of our perspective, but it's very powerful. And if you think about it, the human imagination is sort of like the camera work of like movie making. Okay. You have movie making where the camera work gets very focused on faces. All right. So you have like, say, like close-ups of faces or medium shots or whatever. But then you also have panorama shots where you just look over the panorama and you're not really focused on the people. So the director of a movie can present different points of view that represent for us our more human centered point of view where we see things more from the human interest or let's say from personal interest. Okay, so you can have a shot where it's like a shot where it's seen from the person's point of view, like like a person walking and what they see, like first person POV. But then you can have shots where you see people talking and it's sort of like the human environment, or let's say houses, neighborhoods, human. But you can also have those big panorama shots where you just see like whole landscapes, and basically that represents what we are capable. What the camera can do in a movie sort of is analogous to what we do with our imagination. Okay, so I think a lot of times as human beings, we spend a lot of time in the equivalent of, let's say, a POV shot, or like a shot of just people. Just we spend a lot of our time in the concerns of human interest, personal interest, whatever. But we are also capable of abstracting out to a more panoramic point of view, where our considerations are more like, say, beyond human. Beyond human, just whatever, just dispassionate, neutral, and sort of abstracted away. Okay. And so I think that sort of remote perspective is very useful because it's a tool. It's a tool that allows us to sort of get outside of our personality and sort of see things from way outside, not just seeing things from another person's point of view, but seeing things beyond anybody's point of view. In other words, it's just more distance and it's more, distant. It's like, how would you say, sometimes it's very beneficial to have a mountaintop view, just to add another angle to our combination of points of view. And I think those different points of view, to the extent that we really appreciate them, I think that is spirituality. Okay. So for me, spirituality is just the different perspectives that we can have to the extent that we appreciate them. You know what I mean? Because in other words, having a perspective without appreciation, it's meaningless. Like I could go to the top of a mountain and I could look. I live near a mountain. Okay, I could go to the top of the mountain. I could look over the whole city and the whole panorama, but maybe I just don't even care. I just look without caring, or I look and I'm thinking about the lunch I'm going to have later or whatever. So it's not really appreciation. So for me, as spirituality is when we have different vistas, panoramas, points of view, but with appreciation. Okay. And I think that to me is basically just perspective on steroids, but I think in a sense, I just, you know, I, well, I struggle to see in psychology a heavy emphasis on spirituality. All right. Probably first because spirituality is loaded with a lot of religious connotation. But I also struggle to see psychology presenting much of in terms of philosophy. In other words, I think I would find it very hard to have a recovery without some philosophical perspective. Okay, not just psychological, but also philosophical perspective. I think philosophical is more abstracted from human interest. Okay, and I think that that's a tool I don't see enough in psychology. I think psychology is too wrapped up in the personality and in the human aspect. Okay, I think for us to really gain the tools we need, to have any fighting chance at recovery, I think we need even philosophical abstraction. Basically, we need to have the ability to develop the spirituality of having perspectives that are abstracted beyond even human interest. Okay, because it's not because we're going to abandon the human interest, it's because you need added angles, added points of view, reference, to add perspective. Because when people talk about mindfulness and they say, well, just try to be mindful of your feelings, just try to be mindful of your feelings, okay, that's just, I don't think it's enough. I think you need to have more distant camera angles so that you have the machinery in order to be mindful. You know what I mean? So, in other words, mindful, you can't really be mindful without heavy spirituality. And I think in order to even approach mindfulness, before we even approach mindfulness, I think it would be important for us to develop our spirituality and maybe to, maybe put to rest for just a second, just momentarily, we can just kind of let go of the usual religious connotations we have to the word spirituality, and we can sort of experiment with a more philosophical meaning of spirituality, which really just means having different remote perspectives. Okay, and it's nothing more than just having exercise, taking exercise in sort of taking more appreciation for like broader panoramas of points of view. Okay. Now, what do I mean by that? I think that psychologically, if we just spend more time, let's say, meditating on the open sky, the cosmic, without trying to analyze it, but if we just add more percentage of our consciousness, let's say, dedicated to more remote, abstract points of view, like say the cosmic, just appreciating the cosmos. You don't have to be an astronomer or a physicist. You can just appreciate the cosmos. You can learn about, the orbits of the planets. You could see even the solar system is a very local area, even though it's amazingly large. You could try to imagine, like, you could look at, like, say, the planet. Sorry, guys. This is very frustrating. I can't control my neighbor's dogs. It is horrible. But okay, I'm going to try and continue this. If any, I know people aren't going to watch this. I am frustrated. Okay, but for example, the cosmic, like, just looking at a planet like Jupiter. Okay, Jupiter is actually pretty close to us, but Jupiter is like 3 times as far from us as the sun is. In other words, we are so close to the sun, and Jupiter is like going another distance. I think at least one or two more distances equivalent to what the sun is to us. I mean, Jupiter is pretty far away, but Jupiter shows up very big. Even to the naked eye, Jupiter is a pretty big spot. And to think that the light from the sun only takes minutes to get to the Earth. Or does it take minutes? Let's see, 93 million. No, it takes. I think it. Well, let's just say it doesn't take that long to get to the Earth, but it takes a little bit longer to get to Jupiter. But to think that the light we see in Jupiter is sort of reflected back to us from the sun. You know what I mean? And so it just kind of playing with scale. These are millions of miles, but really relative to the stars in the background, Jupiter is like right next to us. You know what I mean? So it's kind of mind blowing to think that it takes time for the light to travel and bounce off Jupiter, come to us, but Jupiter is super close to us compared to the stars in the background. So just kind of having a sense of these dimensions, I think it's a very good exercise, okay, because it starts to awaken parts of us that are just naturally designed to be very remote from just the immediate human concerns, okay. And I think it's really important for us to exercise those perspectives, those distant perspectives, okay. Maybe that's why in the distant past, when nomadic people had to navigate, that they were exercising, not they were not just involved in their tribe and their soap opera of, the politics of their local tribe, and they're fighting with other tribes, but also there was a part of them that was navigating using the cosmos, and sort of exercising parts of their brain that are sort of calibrated to things far distant, you know what I mean, of a larger scale. Also, people in the past, they became experts in, sort of observing the cosmos to determine, like, say, the seasons, things like that. So basically, I think the human mind basically has different scales of landscape, of vista. Basically, we have different scales, and I have the suspicion that if we're too much involved in the human and the personal, that's when we start that narcissistic collapse, where we start to collapse into just being concerned with what's immediate to us as opposed to the more broader. Okay. Now, of course, eventually we'll get to mindfulness, but mindfulness means nothing if we don't exercise those more long range, sort of, spirits, basically. Basically, the how would you say, like, the different camera distances, basically. If we don't exercise those different far points of view, those different abstract points of view, okay, we're basically not using those parts of the mind that would give us the perspective to actually have mindfulness. Okay, so I really believe that, human beings, we are neurologically evolved to contemplate the cosmic, to contemplate the continental, the earthly at the largest scale, the planetary, the broad horizon. And so I think that it's good for our, sort of, to develop our different perspectives, distance perspectives, to spend a lot of time sort of contemplating the sky, a lot of time contemplating, like, maps, and sort of thinking in terms of, like, continental long distance, maybe to the extent possible where we can actually see long horizons, see big vistas, big views of to the distance, um, where we can spend a lot of our neurological energy, um, sort of calibrated to these more abstract distances and these more abstract points of view, um, to sort of adding exercise to different levels of abstraction. Basically, it's not just an idea; it's actually conditioning ourselves, so that, we start to develop maybe, a richer sense of our identity, not just as people, but also as abstract abstract thinkers or abstract meditators, or contemplators, basically. And so in that sense, we start to develop a sense of ourselves, not just as being a person, not just as being a human being, but also as being sort of a spiritual being, a spiritual being. So that, we don't get, maybe that might help us with our narcissism, or, like, say, the narcissism being too human. You know what I mean? In a sense, being too human is a kind of a narcissism, because we're sort of ignoring the broader, more abstract, capacity that our mind has to be a little more, let's say, removed from just the human concerns. You know what I mean? So I think that those are very good preliminary exercises, so that eventually, when we have, like, say, our cameras set up at a broader scope, you know, that we can have more perspective, not to get collapsed into things and dramas that occupy us, let's say, at the human or personal level. So we don't get too absorbed and fall into those things. So I think that is a fundamental problem with cluster B, is that just because of the noise in our brain, where we're just overly consumed in the human and the interpersonal and the personal affairs and concerns, and we're sort of limited from our more broader perspective. Okay, so I think that spirituality really is perspective with appreciation. All right, and the more we can develop, let's say, more of an appreciation and more time spent, like, say, with the cosmic and the more broad landscape, kind of broad geographical appreciation. Okay, that will sort of set our cameras broader, so that as we do get into personal issues and human issues, we can sort of have that broad perspective already set up, so that we're not just approaching problems as a human being, but we're also approaching them as a spiritual being. Okay. And so when I think of that, I know I'm just a human being. I know that. But part of being a human being is we have the capacity for tremendous abstraction. Okay. And that abstraction sort of allows us to have a more expanded identity, so that one of the curious things about humans is that we don't just think of ourselves as being people. We also think of ourselves as being beings, just beings, spiritual beings. You know what I mean? That's just part of the human psychology, basically. So I think that I don't see how we can meaningfully get much out of mindfulness if we don't first develop our camera angles to sort of develop the cosmic and the planetary and the broad horizon camera angles, so that when we do try to do mindfulness, we have more of a broad perspective in which to have mindfulness. You see what I mean? So mindfulness to me is a product of a broader spirituality, okay, and not a collapsed spirituality. So basically, what is the bottom line of all this? You know, like I struggle with cluster B because I have a noisy brain. I probably have my amygdala is probably screwed up, and I could be a monster. I can be a monster. I can be a disgusting person because my amygdala, probably because my brain makes too much noise. I'm one of those kind of creepy people where when my buttons are pushed and I'm provoked, the noisemakers and the fireworks in my brain they overflood, and they basically cut off all my spiritual perspective. So I'm already running with a deficit. Okay, so I need to have artificial assistance, to help me deal with the worst moments of life. And what I found is that with spirituality, and for me that just means setting my cameras far and practicing with those cameras and spending a lot of time with those cameras, cosmic, planetary, broad horizon, remote vista, basically remote panorama, remote vision, basically abstracted perspective, having a lot of perspective. By exercising all that, I'm developing so that when I have my fireworks on an interpersonal level, I just have a little more active practice and development to just give me a little bit of assistance when I'm already going to tend to collapse with the fireworks that my brain does produce, because my brain does produce fireworks. Okay. So these are just little tools. They're artificial tools, but we are already, as humans, we're already sort of evolved to have remote abstraction. We are already evolved to have philosophical perspective. So what I'm saying is that we ought to develop those things, okay, so that when we need them, they're already exercised and conditioned, and we're in the habit. And we also have an identity. We've developed it, that we are not just people, but we're also spiritual beings in that sense, having, because it becomes part of our identity, even though it's artificial. I know it's artificial. I know it's a product of the imagination, that I can have a lot of cosmic meditation, a lot of like planetary, like broad horizon vista meditation, whatever. I know it's artificial, but it is part of my identity. You know what I mean? And that's just one of the things, that human beings were very, like, say, cosmic, philosophical, abstract beings. And we are able to have the identity of being not just people, but also being spiritual beings. That's just a byproduct of our capacity for abstraction. So I think that in a sense, anybody who has behavior issues, anybody who has, cluster B problems, it's not going to save you. I mean, you're going to have to also work at it, and it's also going to be hard, but it's an assistance. It's a tool. And so I think we ought to approach spirituality not as a salvation, but as a tool that will still be hard to use, because even with spirituality, I still get really provoked on a personal or like, say, a human level. I get very provoked. And so it would be very naive for me to think that having spiritual development would save me. That's not realistic. What it is just an added tool. So I'll still have a lot of difficulty, when I'm provoked or when I'm activated or when I'm stimulated. Okay, yes, I'll still have difficulty, but I'll have more tools, more perspective, more motivation, because I have a more developed identity as not just as a spiritual being. I'm not just a spiritual being. It's just I have an identity as a spiritual being in addition to my identity as a person. Okay. And it also helps with self-esteem too, because if I just had only my personality as it is, okay, I'm kind of a monster. I mean, be honest. I mean, I would have maybe more risk of collapsing into feeling like crap about myself. And of course I can, but I also see myself as sort of a philosophical being or a spiritual being, sort of, and that, it doesn't make me have great self-esteem, but it just reminds me that there's a lot more to me than just my personality. You know what I mean? And so I know a little bit of this is artificial. I know a lot of this is just a product of our imagination. A lot of it is just a product of our abstraction. But humans are abstract. We do have abstraction. We do have the ability to have remote perspective through our imagination. Okay, and so these things they ought to be seen as tools. Not salvations, but tools. Assistance. Anybody who has trouble walking and they get crutches, the crutches aren't going to save you. You're still going to have to learn how to use the crutches. The crutches aren't just going to lift you off the ground. You still have to learn how to use the crutches, but it's a tool, and it can really add a lot of depth and a lot of perspective to our lives, and also to know that in a sense, we were evolved to be philosophical. So we're actually actualizing our potential for what we should be as humans. Humans are not supposed to be just people. You see, that's the thing. We are capable of abstract. We are capable of the philosophical, you know. And so I think that it's very sad to me to look at people like, say, let's look at the Middle East. When I look at the Middle East and I see the problems between Israel and Hamas, I see cluster B dynamics. Okay, because what do I see? I think it's even built into the kind of spirituality, even of the materialism of the Jewish tradition, which is that they sort of leave it to God, they sort of leave it to the Ten Commandments come and they just follow what's written nearsighted, from came down from Mount Sinai. They don't go to Mount Sinai. It came down from Mount Sinai. You know what I mean? So they've sort of developed a thing of we'll just follow the law as it's written, but they don't go to the inspiration mountaintop. You know what I mean? So they've sort of cut off their video, their vista perspectives. They've sort of cut off the cameras from the far distance, and they just focus on the nearsighted, whatever says in the book, basically. And I mean, I'm giving a major caricature, but I'm just saying that in a way, it's kind of true that a lot of cultures, just whatever Muhammad said, my prophet said this, and I follow the Quran, whatever. So I think there are cultures for whatever reason. It's funny because they come from deserts where they have a lot of far distant vision. And in a desert, you can see big distances. So you would think that they'd be really tuned in to the cosmic and the panoramic, but they've really collapsed into the human. And they just they're sort of like the arrangement of their perspectives is just very collapsed into human concerns. They don't have that broader perspective to sort of say, hey, what are we doing? Like you need broad perspective. You need abstract, far distant spiritual perspective to sometimes take a look at yourself and see it from a non-human distance. You know what I mean? And so I think it's sad to see that, in the Middle East, you can really almost see it, how they really lack sort of a perspective to maybe just rethink how they do things, or, maybe they should be maybe more, they should put maybe a higher priority, let's say, on just getting along with people, even though they may not agree, but of course saying that it's like foolish. It's like spitting into the wind because, when you look at the Middle East and you see, just how the culture has become so bigoted. If you're one type of Arab, if you're like a Sunni versus a what is a Sunni, Shiite, Sunni, they don't have any respect for each other. They can't. They're so committed to each position. That in a sense, I just see that as cluster B dynamics. And it's very similar to what we experience, those of us who just have cluster B without religious issues. We're just so collapsed into our own personal perspective, our own personal, whatever our realities. And we don't really ventilate very well to take in realities that are maybe outside our way of thinking, or even better, to even abstract away from human concerns at all and just have the much broader sort of separation to be able to employ the mindfulness that could be so useful, so anyway, I just think that maybe it's just our history, maybe it's just our culture, because we come from a history of being so wrapped up in religions, and maybe we're still in the hangover of a religious past, where even though we've sort of gotten rid of a lot of the religious attachment, I think we may still be, as people, very committed to the sort of the human realm, and sort of the interpersonal realm. And maybe it's a lost art to sort of focus more on the abstract, not because there's aliens out there, not because we're going to learn anything specific. It's just that having the broad sort of distance perspective, the only way we can actually develop that is maybe by contemplating the cosmic without trying to be knowledgeable about it, just appreciating it, and just appreciating big distance perspectives, because I think that exercises the parts of the brain that are sort of abstracted from the human. You see what I mean? I think it's very useful because it gives us perspective. Perspective is always good. And just saying you have perspective and just wanting to have perspective, you have to practice it. You have to condition yourself. So you really have to get on top of a mountain, or you have to find long distance views where you can and really appreciate them, or at least in your imagination, sort of get into the headspace of big distance panoramas, because then that'll sort of awaken those parts of us that are not so locked into the human and the interpersonal, because again, it's not that you want to abandon the personal, it's just you want to add more cameras and put more cameras in more places to get more perspective angles. Okay. And that richens our ability to be mindful. You see what I mean? So if we're going to have mindfulness, you need to set up a lot of cameras at far distances to be able to actually be mindful. You know what I mean? It's being mindful is not just saying it. It's not just wanting it. You have to actually set up the cameras, and then you have to practice and get your brain conditioned to the different dimensions and different levels of abstraction, and actually condition yourself to those things. So we need to actually spend time with cosmic meditation, with maybe when you can, looking at the planets, looking at the stars, trying to actually see how the stars orbit the sun, trying to understand how the earth rotates and orbits the sun, and really spending a lot of time with that, because, without trying to be scientific about it, it's just occupying our mind with more distant concerns. And that will sort of set up our cameras and get them sort of operational and sort of conditioned, so that when we need to be mindful, and sometimes we all need to be mindful at certain critical times when we're really provoked or whatever, and that setup of all those different cameras will give us sort of a meaningful apparatus and framework, so that our mindfulness will actually be meaningful. Okay, so that's what I mean by spirituality. Okay, just different perspectives, okay, with appreciation and with practice and conditioning. Okay, so that to me is spirituality. And I think spirituality is the prerequisite to even begin addressing mindfulness. You can't be mindful without having a good, sort of a broad network of camera angles, as far and extended as possible, including close-up cameras as well. We should strive to be like any good movie. A good movie director will have cameras close up. We'll have cameras showing two people talking. We'll have cameras showing a neighborhood. We'll have cameras sometimes showing a whole, like a panorama, of like a city. And then occasionally you'll see movies where they even show like shots of the planet, or shots of space or whatever. So we should be just as good as Hollywood or any movie in terms of the diversity of camera angles. With appreciation for those different points of view and vistas, basically. And those are sort of the elements of our spirituality if we have appreciation. And so when we really need the assistance, when we're having an interpersonal crisis or a problem or a conflict or a provocation, hopefully we have enough of that set up and we're sort of conditioned to it, that it will at least assist us and provide us with that such valuable asset when we're in crisis, which is perspective. It really is there for a reason, So I know in psychology, they talk a lot about having a conscience and having feelings and having a conscience. But you know what? I think in the end, what's really useful when we're really in crisis is having perspective. I think that's more valuable than what we call the conscience. Okay. If we take the trouble to exercise it and we really suffer it and take it on, with the goal of having a good spiritual identity as a spiritual being. So anyway, have that to offer, spirituality, and really appreciate you watching.